Well, thanks to Jason and our esteemed panel for a wonderful discussion. I'm sure the audience really appreciated, as I did, the really nuanced consideration of the complexities and challenges associated with mitral valve disease. And I think some of the take-home messages that I gleaned were that although the general lessons of the aortic experience are useful in just broad strokes, thinking about unmet need and general approaches to patients, the nuances and complexity of mitral valve are much more challenging. And so I think what's recognized is a real need for better devices that are tailored to specific patient populations, as well as, and I thought this was an interesting, important point that Dr. O'Gara made, the need to think about the natural history of these diseases, whether it's functional mitral regurgitation or degenerative disease, and intervene earlier. Make sure that we're giving patients at risk for functional mitral regurgitation established therapies, as well as the need for newer therapies and better insights into degenerative disease. So really a terrific panel, recognizing the challenges, but also with a sense of optimism that there will be solutions for this large patient population that really is at great need. So next we have a fireside chat with John Lechleiter, who's the chair of the chairman of Eli Lilly, and moderating this discussion, we're fortunate to have Susan Dentzer. Susan is the CEO and president of the Network for Excellence in Health Innovation, which is a nonprofit think tank that seeks to find innovative solutions to healthcare needs. So we're really delighted to have Susan and John with us. So please join me in welcoming them both to the stage. Thanks very much.
John, welcome. It's great to be here with you.
Thank you very much.
We can imagine a roaring fire in the background as we have our fireside chat. And as you know, since this conference is devoted to innovation, we decided to talk about innovation's twin sister, failure, maybe evil twin, failure. Because as we know, on any pathway to innovation, failures are inevitable. You read what Thomas Edison went through on the way to his inventions, and you know that that's the case. So in the case of Lilly, and of course it's not just Lilly, it's many of the major biopharmaceutical companies, one of the biggest areas of disappointment over the last decade has been looking for an effective treatment in Alzheimer's. Right. And in the case of Lilly, which has devoted $3 billion to Alzheimer's research over nearly a 30-year period, this has been particularly disappointing. Last fall, the results were announced of the latest phase 3 trial of solanezumab, the agent that you have been betting a lot on to show efficacy, and the results of that trial showed that it did not significantly help patients with mild disease. It failed to slow the loss of cognitive ability. What we wanted to do in this conversation today was talk about what that's like to be going through as a company, to be placing these big, important bets on very serious targets of debilitating disease, and watch what happens and pick up and move on and recalibrate along the way. So let's go back to your earliest days in this great experiment. How did it all, you of course had isolated the target, which is amyloid, thought this agent was going to be effective. What happened next?
Well, our research, as you mentioned, in Alzheimer's dates back to the late 1980s, where we had a different molecule altogether we were looking at. We started 2 phase 3 programs late in the last decade, more or less in parallel. One was a gamma secretase inhibitor, which is an oral, it was an oral medicine to essentially block gamma secretase, which plays a role in plaque formation. The other was solanezumab, which is a monoclonal antibody that essentially attaches itself to soluble beta amyloid. So there were 2 different approaches. We stopped the semigacistat trial in 2010 for a futility, in essence. We continued with the SOLA study, and in the summer of 2012, we got the data back from two essentially identical trials, Expedition 2, which failed to meet their primary endpoints, but in a pre-specified secondary analysis showed that if you just pulled the mild patients out, these two studies were in both people with both moderate and mild Alzheimer's disease. If you pooled the mild patients, we saw 34% slowing in the rate of cognitive decline in that patient group. And then subsequently, when we completed the extension of both of those studies, we saw what we thought was also encouraging data in that the individuals who had been treated with placebo in the blinded portion never really caught up in terms of cognition with the people who had been treated with solanezumab. So the early data was enough to convince us, the 34% slowing, that we were seeing a drug effect. So we undertook Expedition 3, which, as you say, reported out disappointingly, also did not meet its endpoints. We reported that out last November, but we in that study tested for the presence of amyloid. We think in the original two studies, as many as 25 to 30% of people who were enrolled did not have amyloid. In other words, they may have had a dementia, but it wasn't Alzheimer's dementia. We had no way of effectively screening those folks at that point in time because the diagnostic had not yet been completely developed. So we screened out anyone in this new study who did not have the plaque, and we also studied only mild patients rather than mild to moderate. Looking at the data, which we've shared widely, it's difficult to say there's not something going on, but clearly nothing of significance to the point where we would believe we had a drug that we could register. So that's sort of the state of play at the moment.
So, and as you've said, you learn a lot from failure. What do you think you've learned at this point?
Boy, it's difficult to say. I mean, I think we were all hopeful that we'd see positive results. We continue to believe that amyloid is involved, is a factor in this disease. I think the question is it the culprit ultimately? And so we have other approaches, including looking at tau.
Another protein.
Another essentially misshapen protein in a pathogenic state further downstream from amyloid. You learn in this business to you recover from these things. I mean, I think many of you here know all too well what drug discovery can look like and how difficult it can be. More often than not, you fail in this business, which makes the successes, I think, all the more rewarding. But we will continue our program in Alzheimer's. SOLA continues to be studied in several ongoing trials looking at earlier stages of the disease. I think this is probably the biggest question in the field right now. Are we treating people early enough? People who may be predisposed to Alzheimer's disease but don't yet have symptoms. I'm also encouraged, frankly, by the fact that there are a number of other companies engaged in this. There weren't so many 10 years ago, and I think that we're not the only ones to look at our data and to say, maybe we're onto something, but we're not quite there yet. And I think that the fact that others are investing, that there's a competition in this field, that we're going to harvest that much more learning, even from failure, gives me hope that we'll get to an answer sooner.
I read that the whole group of Alzheimer's drug candidates overall has had a 99.6% failure rate, as distinct from about 80% more or less in cancer drugs. That's astounding. How do you, now we know the burden of Alzheimer's, not just in this country and in the future, but globally, it's huge. How do you persuade a board, an entire company, to stay at it when the failure rate is pretty close to 100%, at least so far?
Well, I think, first of all, our board has been incredibly supportive, especially those individuals on the board who have science and medicine backgrounds. The late Al Gilman from University of Texas Southwestern served on our board for many years. I remember how excited he was when we shared the Expedition and Expedition 2 data with the board in the summer of 2012. Bill Kalin, who works here in Boston at the Dana-Farber, was at the medical meeting here in Boston when we shared that data and heard it firsthand. I think for a large company like Lilly, we spend about $5 billion a year on R&D. It's not all on Alzheimer's. And I think as CEO, the way I thought of it was more a portfolio kind of approach where you're investing some in diabetes research, you're investing some in autoimmune diseases, you're investing some in Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is definitely the high risk, high reward box if you want to make the 2x2 matrix. But I think I have to be convinced, and the board therefore has to be convinced, and ultimately our shareholders have to be convinced that we've got the right balance there. But we're not groping in the dark with Alzheimer's. We have some very tantalizing clues. I mentioned earlier the report from this very small number of people in Iceland who have who essentially have a non-functioning beta secretase and don't really produce the plaques and have been shown to be cognitively normal well into their 80s and 90s. I mean, we have some evidence that I think gives me confidence that there's substrate there we can work with, but we need more research to better understand the pathophysiology and to try to ultimately establish what I before referred to as the culprit. We're trying to participate in that by developing imaging agents. Amyvid is one of several agents now available as a PET ligand that enables us to quantify plaque, deposited amyloid plaque. We're working on a tau reagent as well, and I think ultimately the hope would be that maybe with tau we could develop that as a quantitative tool and even as a potential surrogate endpoint to measure disease progression. Today we obviously do that using essentially questionnaires.
Right. And as you said, a real possibility is not intervening early enough in the disease process. And since we have the hypothesis that this disease process starts 10 or more years before symptoms show up, what could be ahead of us is a really long trial where essentially you start by treating people who are not overtly sick, who may have a genetic predisposition or whatever. So that is going to represent a whole new set of complexities in terms of testing hypotheses and then waiting to see what the results are, even if you have surrogate endpoints along the way.
Well, I think some of those trials are underway, and I think that may be what we have to do when we think of trying to prevent or lessen the burden of cardiovascular disease. We think of people taking statins very early on in their lives at a point where cardiovascular disease is not manifest. So, I think there's sort of a mental analogy there, but that remains to be proven. But certainly there are many people that believe that that's going to be the case, that if people, particularly people who are predisposed because of genetics to Alzheimer's disease or who carry a heavy amyloid burden already, that perhaps treating early with one of these amyloid type medicines would be the answer. But that's remains to be proven, and yes, it appears that would that's quite a lengthy time course potentially.
So as you well know, we're in the midst again of a raging drug pricing debate. And claims that of course, U.S. prices are higher overall for branded drugs than the rest of the world, that the U.S. some claim should not be subsidizing the research burden for the rest of the world. But be that as it may, in effect it is, and that's one of the rationales for very high drug pricing, especially for the new class of specialty medications that are coming down, and certainly this one would fit into that category if it ultimately proves successful. What is often not really grappled with in this debate is failure, is the cost of failure. And if we are close to a 100% failure rate for Alzheimer's drugs, we're going to have to incorporate a lot of the cost of failure into whatever emerges as an effective agent. How are you thinking about that? How is your board thinking about that? How would that sale be made effectively to the American public, that part of this process is paying for failure?
It's a tough sell. It's a tough sell, and I think reactions range from mild empathy all the way back to essentially someone saying to me, that's your problem, don't make it my problem. And I think that, so I think we try to start with how can we tackle this high failure rate? In other words, are there ways in which we can reduce the failure rate? And I think in part there are strategies that we're using to speed up the process of drug discovery and development, but also to, I guess you could say, hedge our bets along the way to try to cut our losses. If we can get critical information sooner, where we don't have to run a big expensive phase 3 trial to determine whether the drug's going to succeed or not. That wasn't the case with Alzheimer's, but fortunately it is the case in many other drug categories. But I think that as whether it's cardiovascular disease or Alzheimer's or any other therapeutic areas, we think about the true breakthroughs that we all strive for, that we know we need or want. This is going to take significant investment. And of course, a big part of that investment are going to be the dead ends that hopefully inform that next series of experiments, and hopefully, as I said earlier about Alzheimer's, lead to the answer that much sooner by enabling the scientific community to put together all of this information and to learn from it.
So we have about 10 minutes left in our conversation, so let's take a couple of questions that have come up. First of all, Hannah asked, and she obviously followed this trial very, very closely, why did you decide not to use any biomarkers for patient stratification in the Expedition trial or for SOLA development?
Well, I'd like to talk to Hannah to get a clarification there. I mean, I think the key biomarker, obviously, that we did invoke in Expedition 3 was the presence of amyloid. And, the fact that essentially maybe a quarter of the patients in the earlier studies were, say, misdiagnosed, I think it lends credence to that. I mean, obviously, we captured a lot of information about those individual patients, and but I think the key for us in that study was mild, as defined by the cognitive scoring that classifies individuals into the mild or moderate category, and the presence of amyloid.
Okay. And we have another question from Anthony, who asks, can you speak to the relationship between cardiometabolic disease and Alzheimer's, and whether early intervention in this area should be a focal point for intervention?
Well, I'm not nearly well enough trained to talk intelligently about the connections between these two therapeutic areas. I do. I hope that at some point we are able to treat early, because certainly to date, no intervention that's been made, while the disease is raging and evident, have been successful. I think, and it's important to understand that we can ease a tremendous amount of suffering and save a tremendous amount of societal costs in both human and dollar costs by just delaying the onset of the disease. So today, about 1 out of 8 people over 65 have Alzheimer's in the U.S., 1 out of 2 over 85. If we can push those numbers out and delay the onset of the disease, that in itself would be a huge step forward. If we could prevent Alzheimer's altogether, obviously that would be the ultimate goal.
So I want to talk a bit about the relationship between basic research and biopharmaceutical research and development. Of course, as we know, last year the Congress agreed to give the National Institutes of Health a reasonably good-sized funding increase after many years of flat and in terms of adjusting for biomedical price inflation falling appropriations for NIH. Now we have the new administration proposing deep cuts in the NIH budget and a lot of discussion again about the value of basic research, especially carried out at the governmental level or funded by the government. How important or not important is ongoing basic research in dementias to your efforts?
Well, it's extremely important, and I've gone on record as saying the whole time I was CEO, and I'll say it again, it'd be a huge mistake to cut the NIH budget. I think Francis Collins told me a couple years ago when you adjust for inflation, the budget peaked in 2003, not 2013, but 2003. The industry that I'm part of spent about $70 billion in R&D last year. Most of that was in D. We have at Lilly, of that $5 billion, we probably spend $1 billion or less on what you would call research. We depend on work done in universities, work done in research institutes, work funded by the federal government or carried out directly by the NIH for our substrate. We don't discover many biological targets. We try to utilize that information to do what we're really good at, which is to figure out how can we develop a potential therapeutic intervention. So it's an ecosystem. And I think medical progress ultimately comes in the form of commercially viable tools, whether it's radiography or whether it's a medical device or whether it's a drug. But I think the background, the way in which those interventions get developed depends on a robust funding of the NIH and other institutions. I think, the other thing, those of us who got advanced degrees in the sciences and know how much we depend on the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, et cetera, for training grants. I mean, when we talk about who's going to do all this work, well, it's going to be the scientists and engineers of the future, the young people who hopefully will be interested in science and go to our great universities. They're the envy of the world, and receive this training, but a lot of that training is funded through these government institutions. So I think it'd be a huge mistake to make these cuts. I said many years ago, when we look back 100 years from now, I won't be around, I don't think, but this will have been the biomedical century. Last century, as a chemist, I can say proudly, was a century of chemistry and physics. This will be the biomedical century, but we better not blow it. I think it'd be a big mistake not to move forward and build on this huge reservoir of knowledge that we've developed just in the last 20 to 30 years for the benefit of society at large.
Well, I hope somebody in the audience tweeted that out for the benefit of those in Washington. So just to go back to this journey of Alzheimer's drug discovery that you've been on, and I don't want to turn this into true confessions of a biopharmaceutical CEO, but was there anything, if you had to rerun the tape, anything you would have done differently? Any point at which you would have turned a different way or turned the company a different way? It's really hard to say. I mean, I think that in many ways we were and are all in Alzheimer's. I mean,
you know, we're participating in several big important academic studies still. We have 8 potential drugs in the clinical stage of development now. We have a diagnostic under development. You know, I wish we could have moved faster and learned faster. I wish it didn't have to take years to close the next feedback loop before we know what to do. But I would do it over again in a minute. Within a few days of seeing the study results in the summer of 2012, I and a few others at Lilly looked at each other and said, we've got to do the next study. Let's get planning the next study. We were reasonably confident what we had there was not going to be the basis for regulatory filing. We needed more information. We needed a better outcome. I would have done it again in a minute. I think as we think back now on the design of Expedition 3, it's proving very difficult, you know, for us to sort of say, aha, there's an easy way of explaining why the treatment effect wasn't more robust. But we'll continue to tap into the best minds in the world and hopefully learn from that and hopefully find ways to do these studies that don't require 3 or 4 or 5 year turnaround times. I remain optimistic. I hate to sort of, you know, I'm not a person to say, well, in 5 years this and in 10 years that, but I am optimistic that sometime in the next decade we will have a disease-modifying agent of some kind available based on the research that we're doing and that many others are engaged in right now.
And just final words, perhaps you've shared some with your successor who's taking over as CEO, how to stay the course amid these challenges of episodic failure and occasional gratifying successes.
Yeah, you know, Lilly's been on quite a journey. I mean, when I became CEO in 2008, we faced the prospect of losing our 4 biggest products to patent expirations. That happened. It's as certain as death and taxes, it turns out. We lost 40% of our revenue in about a 2.5 year period. And of course, we had lots of people, including some investors, telling us that we should sell the company, split the company up, slash research, you name it. Well, we actually increased our investment in research in absolute dollars every single year through a period where we were taking this big hit. And we did that not because for its own sake, but because we believe that was the way out, that investing appropriate investments in innovation would ultimately result in the kinds of medicines that would bring the sort of value that would drive Lilly's growth and future. And that's what's happened. I never thought I'd live to see the day when certain serious investors would argue that we should cut research, that we were wasting money on it. It is a risky enterprise. I can't apologize for failure when you're working in this space, and I think all of us who run these companies have to have the courage of our convictions. I don't think there's ever been a better time to do drug discovery and development than today. I mean, when I joined Lilly in 1979, discovering a new drug was like finding your way around a dark room and figuring out where you were, what is it you had in your hands, and how are you going to find your way out. Today, the lights are on. We can see things. We can see the pathways. We can understand biology. It doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean the bar hasn't gone up. It has. But I think it's taking advantage of all this knowledge and having the courage to stick with it.
Well, John, it was an amazing run, notwithstanding these failures, and thank you for inspiring everybody in the audience.
You bet.
Great chat. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.